Welcome, dear listener, to a London shrouded in secrets. Tonight, we invite you into the shadowed world of Clara Whitby, a brave seamstress with a scandalous past, and Detective Inspector Nathaniel Gray, a man whose cold logic is about to meet its most dangerous temptation. In a city where a whisper can ruin a life and a kiss can betray an oath, they are drawn together by a killer and bound by a love that is absolutely forbidden. Are you ready to discover the fire beneath the fog? Then settle in, for the threads of destiny are already being pulled tight, and be sure to subscribe now so you don't miss a single moment of this heart-wrenching romance. Part 1, The Seamstress and the Shadow. The year was 1888, and London was a city of perpetual dichotomy, smelling of coal smoke and roses, where unimaginable wealth brushed shoulders with the most abject poverty. But in the autumn, one scent dominated all, the damp, heavy cloak of fog. It rolled in from the Thames like a malignant spirit, muffling the clip-clop of horses and transforming the familiar gaslights into halos of sickly amber light. It was beneath one of these gaslights on a cobbled lane in Whitechapel that the latest victim had been found. Detective Inspector Nathaniel Gray stood over the scene, his tall, disciplined figure swallowed by the swirling mist. His topcoat, the color of midnight, was drawn tight against the pervasive chill, but the cold he felt went deeper than the marrow. It resided in his soul, a permanent frost laid down by the years spent wading through the city's endless muck and human misery. Another one, the fifth in as many months. And like the others, she was a working girl, a girl who hadn't the luxury of a carriage and a footman to see her home. The killer, whom the more sensational newspapers had already christened the Gaslight Killer, was becoming bolder. He left no prints, only a distinctive token near the body, always something from the world of the gentry, a silver-crested cufflink, a piece of watered silk ribbon, a cruel mockery of the life they would never touch. Still nothing, Inspector? It was the gruff, too-loud voice of Inspector Calloway, Nathaniel's superior. Calloway was a brute of a man, smelling faintly of stale gin, whose uniform always seemed slightly rumpled, a mirror to his loose morals. Nathaniel did not turn. Only that he is careful, sir. Too careful. He moves through the shadows as if they belong to him. Then you must take them back, Gray, Calloway sneered, lowering his voice conspiratorially. The papers are screaming. The commissioner is agitated. Catch this beast, or they'll name you a failure before the month is out, and I won't be the one to protect you from the consequences. The implied threat was as thick as the fog. Calloway was the type to use a man's failure as a stepping stone for his own meager ambition. Nathaniel merely clenched his jaw, his eyes, usually a chilling clear gray, darkened with a deep sense of weary resolve. He would catch this man, not for Calloway or the commissioner or the screaming papers, but for the girls whose lives were snuffed out like cheap tallow candles. Meanwhile, a world away from the grit of the East End alley, yet perilously close, a different sort of work was taking place in the quiet, stuffy atmosphere of Madame Dubois's dressmaker's shop. The air here was heavy with the sweet, dry smell of fine wool, linen, and silk, a silent protest against the corruption outside. Clara Whitby, at 24, was the shop's most gifted seamstress. Her hands, though they moved with the practiced speed of one who toiled for a wage, possessed a delicate artistry. As she sat hunched over her work, when mending a tear in a heavy, dark blue officer's coat, the sole light came from a single oil lamp, catching the bright copper of her hair, which was twisted into a severe, practical knot. Clara was not frail, but her slenderness hinted at years of insufficient meals and ceaseless work. Her most arresting feature was her eyes, a deep, unsettling brown that seemed to hold both immense kindness and a lifetime of hard-won wisdom. They were eyes that had seen too much, eyes that knew the exact measure of shame and the precise cost of a secret. The coat upon her lap belonged to the police, and a heavy sense of dread weighed upon her as she worked the needle. It was a coat that had seen the very things she feared most in the world. She needed the work desperately. The wages were essential for the small, shared room she kept with her younger sister, Lydia, whose wide-eyed innocence was a constant source of both comfort and terror. Clara's great secret, the one she carried like a stone in her pocket, was that she had not always been a seamstress. She had been a maid in the grand household of Lady Pembroke, an aristocratic lady whose drawing rooms were lined with gilded mirrors and whose heart was made of stone. A scandal, a falsehood, a wicked accusation of theft she could not disprove, had forced her to flee in the dark of night, trading the maid's cap for the needle and thread and the fine houses for the perilous streets of the ordinary folk. As she carefully stitched the lining, resecuring a stray, expensive gold button with a tiny, distinctive lion crest, the bell above the shop door jangled, a violent interruption to the shop's silence. A shadow fell across her work. Madame Dubois, a cold, deep voice commanded. I was told the repair on my coat would be finished by midday. Clara did not need to look up to know who it was. The coat on her lap had a distinctive cut, a precision of tailoring that bespoke a man of some standing. When she finally raised her eyes, she found them locked with the very owner of the garment. It was Detective Inspector Nathaniel Gray. His presence filled the cramped space. He was a head taller than most men and possessed a stillness that was utterly arresting. She felt the impact of his gaze like a physical blow. His eyes, the cold gray she had imagined, seemed to penetrate the protective shell she had spent years building. They were the eyes of a man who looked for the truth and rarely found comfort in it. He, in turn, paused. He had expected to see a fluttering, elderly shopkeeper. He had not expected to encounter a woman with the quiet intensity of a martyr and the sharp, intelligent gaze of a scholar. There was an unexpected spark of life in her features, a hidden fire that seemed utterly out of place amongst the dusty fabrics. "The coat is finished, Inspector," Clara said, her voice soft but steady. She folded the heavy wool and presented it to him. Nathaniel took it, and as his fingers brushed hers, a shiver, sudden and electric, ran through them both. He dismissed it as the cold and the exhaustion of the morning's gruesome work. She dismissed it as the simple terror of being so close to a representative of the law, the very thing she fled. He pulled the coat on, noting the repair was impeccable, seamless, professional. His eyes, keen and analytical, immediately fell to the cuff. "This button," he observed, pointing to the expensive, gold-crested button she had just secured. "It was loose when I dropped the coat off. It is not the coat's original button." Clara felt a sickening lurch in her stomach. His perceptiveness was alarming. "No, sir," she replied, keeping her voice even. "The original was brass and quite worn. It did not suit the quality of the coat. I had this one spare. I simply sewed it on more firmly. It is of a finer make." He studied her face for a long moment, the silence thick and charged. "It is a distinctive crest," he mused, his hand covering the button. "A lion rampant, one I've seen before." Lies. Her heart hammered. He will see the lie. The button, in fact, had been very loose, the thread barely holding, and she had recognized the crest instantly. It was the mark of the Pembroke family, the family she had once served. The button must have been left in the pocket of the coat, a stray piece of a gentleman's attire. "Many gentlemen wear lion crests, Inspector," she managed, dropping her gaze back to her needlework. "It is merely a very common design." He stood there for another full minute, his shadow falling long and black across the floorboards. She could feel the relentless force of his logic searching for a flaw in her simple explanation, but he found none. "Very well, miss," he said finally, his voice oddly soft. "Thank you for the excellent repair." He dropped the payment on the counter and walked towards the door. He was almost out when he stopped and turned, his eyes once more finding hers. Not cold now, but holding a strange, unreadable intensity. "There was a stain inside the sleeve," he said, his voice low. "Near the elbow. Did you notice it?" Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She had noticed it. A stain she had instinctively scrubbed away before she even started mending. A splash of something dark and viscous, smelling faintly of cheap perfume and copper. Blood. She forced herself to meet his gaze, keeping her breathing steady. "I did, sir. It looked like wine or a bit of ink. I removed it. One cannot return a fine coat in a stained condition." Nathaniel gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "No, one cannot." He did not believe her. The conviction settled over her like a shroud. He knew she had seen something she should not have, something that might tie his coat, and by extension him, to the dark deeds he investigated. The stain of a life ended. She watched him walk out the door and disappear into the white, suffocating fog, his silhouette dissolving quickly beneath the flickering gaslight on the corner. The air he left behind felt suddenly thin and perilous. Their paths had crossed. a seamstress, bound by fabric and thread, and a detective, bound by duty and law. He was looking for a truth that could save a city. She was hiding a truth that could destroy her life, and in his cold, analytical gray eyes, she had seen not just suspicion, but a flicker of recognition, a dangerous and undeniable alignment of their fates. Part 2. Threads of Suspicion. The following afternoon, Detective Inspector Gray returned to the dressmaker's shop, but not in his official capacity. He arrived in a subdued tweed coat, his manner less the relentless hunter of the law, and more a man with an uncomfortable curiosity. He presented Madame Dubois with a preposterous query about finding a suitable velvet for a waistcoat, a garment he clearly possessed no interest in, and quickly maneuvered himself to Clara's workspace. Clara, whose needle had been flying with unnatural haste since his last visit, felt a familiar tension tighten in her chest. She had spent the last 24 hours mentally dismantling the moment, the brush of their hands, the cold precision of his questions, the awful finality of his gaze upon the newly secured button. "Miss Whitby," Nathaniel began, pitching his voice low so as not to carry beyond the immediate area. "I have been preoccupied by our discussion yesterday about the stain, the wine, or ink." Clara kept her eyes fixed on the fine linen she was hemming, concentrating on the perfect regularity of her stitches. "And what of it, Inspector? I assure you it is quite gone." "I do not doubt your skill with a brush, miss. I doubt your explanation." He leaned closer, the scent of pipe tobacco and clean wool replacing the musty shop air. "That was not a stain of claret. It was a stain of fresh arterial blood, and you knew it." A cold finger of fear traced her spine. She carefully laid her needle down. "You are mistaken, sir. I see many things upon the garments that pass through my hands. Grease, food, mud. I do not interrogate every spot of grime. But you interrogate that which is unusual, do you not?" His eyes, the color of a winter sea, seemed to anchor her. "That button you secured, the lion rampant. I have been informed that it belongs to the Viscount Carrington's livery. His house is not 2 streets from the latest crime scene." Clara swallowed, her composure beginning to crack beneath the heat of his logic. She had known the crest. She had recognized it from her days at Lady Pembroke's estate, who was often in society with the Carringtons. If a loose button of a certain family falls into an officer's pocket, I cannot be expected to account for it, Inspector. My job is to sew it firmly back in place. Nothing more. Her voice was sharper now, laced with a defiance born of necessity. She would not let him bully her into confessing the knowledge she had accidentally acquired. Nathaniel studied the rigid set of her shoulders, not with judgment, but with an unsettling blend of suspicion and reluctant admiration. He saw not a frightened girl, but a woman standing guard over a secret. "You have a discerning eye, Miss Whitby, and a sharp mind. It is clear you have been studying more than your embroidery." It was true. As the weeks had turned into months and the bodies of the murdered women, always from the poorer classes, always with a mocking token of aristocracy left behind, piled up, Clara had been piecing together a silent, frightening puzzle of her own. The women were her neighbors, her peers, girls she saw every day. She had noticed that the scraps of fine fabric often mentioned in the sensational newspapers, a piece of silk near the first victim, a velvet snood near the third, all bore the distinct expensive markings of textiles found in the highest-end London houses. She had even quietly gone to the location of the latest tragedy, telling Lydia she was visiting a sick friend, and found a tiny, nearly invisible fragment of gold braid snagged on a railing. It was the same braid used to trim the collar of a high-ranking officer's formal uniform, or an aristocratic footman's livery. She was not merely trying to solve a crime. She was trying to protect her fragile neighborhood, to protect Lydia, who, being young and impressionable, often dreamed of escaping their dreary existence by any means necessary. "I only wish to protect the women who share this street, Inspector," Clara admitted, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "We are not all blind to the danger. We know when a certain type of carriage passes through, or when a man wears fine cloth, he shouldn't. If the police cannot protect us, then we must protect ourselves." The honesty in her voice was a physical blow to Nathaniel's cynicism. He had expected denial, not this quiet, fierce declaration of courage. He saw then that her desire for justice was as profound as his own, yet stripped of the badge and the authority. She was fighting a killer with only a thimble and thread. "You are gathering clues," he stated, his suspicion transforming into a dangerous kind of awe. "And you are doing so on your own. Do you understand the peril you are placing yourself in?" "I understand what happens if I do nothing," she retorted, lifting her chin. "Does the law care if a poor seamstress is found dead in the gutter, Inspector? Or only that the killer is caught before the reputation of the yard is further tarnished?" The question was a direct accusation against the corruption he fought daily against men like Calloway. Nathaniel felt a profound, aching kinship with her in that moment. She was a single brave light in the surrounding darkness. The cold, logical wall around his heart began to thaw, replaced by an unsettling conflict. He was torn between the suspicion his duty demanded and the potent admiration her courage ignited. The interrogation, if it could be called that, ended abruptly when Madame Dubois called Clara away to assist a flustered customer. Nathaniel left the shop, his steps no longer driven by the case, but by an acute sense of unease. He was no closer to catching the killer, but he was dangerously close to compromising his own stringent morality for the woman he had just accused. Dusk fell quickly, bringing with it a thicker, more menacing mist. Nathaniel performed a few routine inquiries, but his focus was fractured. All he could see was Clara's face, resolute and gentle, illuminated by the oil lamp. He knew she had to walk home alone from the dressmaker's shop, through the increasingly deserted streets near closing time. The thought of her solitary figure, unprotected, moving through the very fog that shielded the killer, was unbearable. He positioned himself on a darkened corner, telling himself it was surveillance, a monitoring of a person of interest. It was past 9 when the shop door finally opened. Clara emerged, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders. She carried a small, flickering lantern, its feeble glow fighting bravely against the overwhelming gloom. The sight of her, fragile yet determined, walking into the white abyss of the night, struck him with a terrible premonition. He watched her, a silent, disciplined shadow. She was about halfway down the lane when he saw it. A second shadow, detaching itself from the deeper obscurity of an alleyway. It was too low, too quick to be a drunkard. It was the stealthy, predatory movement of a hunter. Nathaniel's breath hitched. Duty vanished. Logic dissolved. All that remained was a searing protective instinct. He moved, covering the distance with the silent speed he had perfected on the beat. The shadow lunged towards Clara. "Police! Halt!" Nathaniel's voice cut through the damp air like a whip. The figure hesitated, startled. Nathaniel drew the heavy revolver from his coat and held it steady, aimed into the mist. Clara screamed, not in terror, but in a gasp of surprise, turning her head back just as the shadow fled, melting back into the unnavigable maze of the fog-choked street. Nathaniel reached her in 2 long strides, his hand closing hard around her arm, steadying her. "Are you harmed? Did he touch you?" he demanded, his voice a strained, low rasp, his gaze still fixed on where the attacker had vanished. "No, Inspector. She trailed off, staring not at the empty alley, but at him. The gun was still drawn, the cold metal glinting in the faint light of her lantern. The severity of the danger was suddenly terribly real. Then she saw it. In his eyes, the relentless, logical, gray eyes of a man who measured his feelings in degrees of duty, there was a raw, naked look of fear. It was not the impersonal dread of a detective facing a failure of the law. It was a terrifying, private fear. Fear for her. It was the first time she realized that his involvement with her was no longer purely professional. He was afraid to lose her to the very darkness he had sworn to fight. "You mustn't walk alone," he murmured, holstering the gun with a sharp click that broke the silence. He was breathing heavily, his discipline momentarily shattered. "I will not permit it." He took the lantern from her trembling hand, his fingers briefly covering hers, and began to walk beside her. They did not speak of the crime, the clues, or the blood-stained coat. They simply walked through the oppressive, silent fog of London, a detective and a seamstress, united by a narrow escape and a terrifying dawning realization of their impossible connection. Part 3. Beneath the Gaslight. The near attack solidified the unspoken arrangement between them. Nathaniel could not, in good conscience, turn Clara in to Calloway, who would inevitably dismiss her observations as the hysteria of a low-class woman, nor could he allow her to walk into danger unprotected. Clara, seeing the law's failure to protect the vulnerable, recognized in Nathaniel a rare integrity. Their partnership had to be kept secret, a fragile thing hidden from the pervasive gaze of Scotland Yard and the judgmental whispers of her neighbors. They settled on a meeting place, the gaslight on the corner outside Madame Dubois's shop. It was a spot both public enough to appear innocuous, yet secluded enough once the late-night fog descended, muffling the sounds and softening the harsh edges of their desperate reality. Every night after the shop closed and the final carriages had rattled past, Clara would wait. And every night Nathaniel would arrive, shedding his formal police composure the moment he stepped into the hazy pool of light. They began with the case. Clara shared the fragments she had gathered, the quality of the fabrics, the small, aristocratic tokens that spoke not of robbery, but of a perverse, high society ritual. Nathaniel, in turn, shared the scant details he dared divulge, the patterns, the timing, the increasing boldness of the killer. One evening, their conversation drifted, as it inevitably did, away from the crime and into the dangerous, intimate territory of their pasts. "You look at this city as if you bear its weight, Inspector," Clara observed gently, leaning back against the cold stone wall, the flickering gaslight casting her profile in soft, uncertain shadow. "It is too much for one man." Nathaniel sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion. "I came to the Yard to fix the city, Miss Whitby. I arrived full of arrogant certainty about justice and law. The city showed me that justice is a luxury only the rich can afford." He paused, then stared at the swirling fog. "I was married to a woman named Eleanor. She was light, all light. She had no fear of the shadows I walked in. She was a teacher, working with the children in the poorest parts of Lambeth." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "She contracted the fever last winter. I was too busy hunting a thief to notice the chills until it was too late." He had never spoken of his late wife to anyone in the Yard. The words, raw and unpracticed, felt like a confession. He had sworn to protect the innocent, and he had failed the one most precious to him. His relentless pursuit of the Gaslight Killer was, in part, a desperate attempt to redeem that failure. "She showed me that purity could exist in this place," he finished, his voice rough. "And when I lost her, the light seemed to go out of London entirely." Clara felt a piercing sympathy and understanding that transcended their class divide. He too was haunted, driven by guilt and a profound sense of loss. "I know what it is to be ruined by a shadow," she confessed, her own words hushed. "Before Madame Dubois, I was a maid at Lady Pembroke's household, a grand, terrible place. My sister Lydia was just a child. They needed a scapegoat for some missing jewels, the sort that would never be traced back to the family who truly stole them." Her fingers twisted the edge of her shawl. "I was accused of theft. The shame would have broken my parents. I was forced to flee. It was a choice between my honor and my family's survival. I chose survival. We moved to this place, and I told Lydia it was merely a change of work, but I lost my good name, Inspector. The truth is, I am a pariah, and if anyone here knew, I would lose this job, and Lydia would be left unprotected." Their secrets, heavy with shame and guilt, hung in the cold night air. The gap between the revered detective and the disgraced seamstress had narrowed to nothing. They were two wounded souls, finding solace in the absolute, hidden truth of the other. Every night, their whispers beneath the gaslight turned not just into shared clues, but into unspoken confessions of yearning. Nathaniel found himself lingering, driven not by professional curiosity, but by a consuming desire to shield her, to know the warmth of her quiet courage. Clara, in turn, began to rely on his silent strength, finding in his cold exterior a burning core of moral integrity she had never believed existed in a man of his authority. The investigation, driven by Clara's intimate knowledge of gentry habits and Nathaniel's access to official records, began to crystallize. One late evening, Clara brought a crucial detail. "The Viscount Carrington's house, where your button likely came from, is near where the second body was found. But I remember from my time near the aristocracy, the Carrington daughter, Lady Amelia, recently lost her fiancé. The gentleman was noted for his gambling debts. He was often seen at a disreputable club in Covent Garden." Nathaniel's eyes flashed with sudden, intense clarity. Disreputable, you say? A gentleman's club where titles and poverty mix freely? He spent the next day following that lead, confirming that the club was indeed a nexus for highborn men with base appetites. He unearthed a chilling detail. The latest victim had been a waitress there. That evening, beneath the gaslight, Nathaniel returned, his face a mask of cold fury. The Carringtons' former footman was dismissed last month, Miss Whitby, for excessive cruelty and debt. He had access to the master's clothing, his cufflinks, his buttons. He fits the profile of a man who would mock the class he serves. But the footman did not have the power to suppress the investigation, Clara countered, her voice trembling with rising dread. He doesn't have the authority to choose which records are buried and which crimes are ignored. They looked at each other, the same horrifying realization dawning in their eyes. The killer was targeting women associated with the aristocratic circle, and he was leaving tokens that pointed toward himself or someone close to him. The murders were not random acts of violence, but calculated distractions, a trail of false clues. The killer was not merely a footman with a grudge. He had a connection to high society and the power to manipulate the police force. A fresh wave of terror washed over Clara as Nathaniel's gaze intensified. He had seen her connection to Lady Pembroke and the high society world she had fled. The footman may be involved, Nathaniel stated, his voice a low growl. But the man protecting him, the man ordering the case to be mishandled, that is a man with a badge. And Clara, that clue you gave me about the Carringtons' gambling circle. He gripped her arms suddenly, his strong hands holding her as if to anchor her against a gale. The warmth of his touch was a startling contrast to the cold danger of his words. It means that you, with your past knowledge of these families, your sharp eye for their crests and fabrics, you are no longer a witness. You are a threat to them. And if I am right about who is covering this up, then you are the next target.
I know who truly killed him, Detective. It was my father.
And so concludes the first part of our journey. But the danger is only just beginning. Clara and Nathaniel have shared their darkest truths beneath the flickering gaslight, but the killer has also found a new clue, one that ties his wicked acts to the very noble family Clara once fled. Nathaniel knows with chilling certainty that his brave seamstress is now the next target. Will the detective choose his badge or the woman who has shown him what light truly is? The fog is closing in, secrets are exposed, and in part 2, a forbidden kiss will change everything.